Hi, everyone. I'm McKenna. I'm the owner of Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas, and I'm excited today to be hosting one of our international overseas afternoon events. For those of you who've been tuning into our virtual events for a long time, we always host our authors who are across the Atlantic in the middle of the afternoon. So I hope you can pour yourself a cup of tea and enjoy this conversation featuring Bonnie MacBird, who will be talking about her new book, What Child Is This? And she's in conversation with fellow famous Sherlockian Leslie Klinger. Before I bring them on, I also just want to remind everyone that it's more fun if you have questions. So about halfway through the chat, I'll be back on here to take a look at the questions you've put in the comments on Facebook or in the live chat on YouTube, and we will certainly get to those. Don't be shy. If you want further information about either author or you're inclined to order books, and we do have signed book plates for What Child Is This? There is a link I've already put in the comments on Facebook and in the live chat on YouTube, and you can go to that link to read more about both authors and potentially order their books from Murder by the Book. I think that covers our housekeeping. I will go ahead and bring on Bonnie MacBird. Hi, Bonnie. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks.
It's good to see you. Of course. It's my pleasure. As you know, I'm a big fan of these books, and I personally am excited to see Sherlock with his violin on the cover. You know, my personal interest in violin. But let me go ahead and get you introduced, and we'll bring Les on. So Bonnie MacBird is passionate about Victorian London and Sherlock Holmes. She lives in an 1890 building right off Baker Street and fell in love with Holmes as a schoolgirl in her native California. After many years in the entertainment industry as a film executive, Emmy-winning producer, and screenwriter, she now writes the critically acclaimed Sherlock Holmes Adventure Series for HarperCollins, bringing the much-loved detective back, traditional style in full-length adventures. Meticulous research, a flair for deductions, and a decided sense of humor have turned these into fan favorites. Art in the Blood was translated into 19 languages and was followed by Unquiet Spirits and The Devil's Due. And as I mentioned, we have a Christmas adventure called What Child Is This? That is freshly out, and we are excited about. We also are joined, as I mentioned, by Leslie Klinger. Hi, how are you today?
Great.
Thank you so much for being here and doing this interview, making my life easy. We always love a guest moderator.
Well, Bonnie's an old friend, and that is to say, a longtime friend, and we love talking to each other about our.
I can't hear Les.
Okay, well,
no. I mean that just happened because beforehand I was hearing him just fine.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you and see you, and I can't see or hear Les.
Okay, I don't know why that is. I can see and hear Les, but obviously we're going to have to solve this. So, Bonnie, why don't you go away like you did just a little bit ago? Leave the platform and come back, and maybe you'll be here, and I will. She's gone, and I will go ahead and do your introduction while she's rejoining the studio. So Leslie Klinger is one of the world's foremost authorities on Sherlock Holmes. He's the editor of the 3-volume New Annotated Sherlock Holmes. The first 2 volumes, the complete short stories, won the Edgar for Best Critical Biographical Work. He's also the editor of the hugely successful The New Annotated H.P. Lovecraft. Klinger is a member of the Baker Street Irregulars and lives in Malibu. And your most recent book is the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde collection, which we'll get to in just a little bit. But Bonnie is here. Fingers crossed that she can hear us. Can you hear us?
I can hear you and see you.
And what about me?
Yes, I can hear and see you too, Les.
Oh, that's good, because otherwise it was going to be hard to have a conversation. So,
right, yeah, it would be very hard.
So what's going to happen is, fingers crossed, everyone's going to stay in the studio except me. I'm going to go away, and I'm going to just sit here quietly behind the scenes waiting for any technical difficulties that arise. If there are none, call me on in about 35 or 40 minutes, and we'll get to the crowd questions. Y'all have fun.
Thank you.
Great. Well, Bonnie, it's lovely to see you and talk about our favorite subject.
Right.
So let me start by asking you a pointed question, which is, why are we here? Why are we here? Meaning, why have you written another book? What is it that keeps drawing you to
I just can't
this?
stop, Les. It's all your fault.
It's a compulsion?
It is a compulsion, I guess. It's an addiction. I don't know. But, when I first started thinking about doing this, and I contacted you, this is years ago. I
Back when
remember
you
you
were
telling me,
12
like,
years
I don't
old.
like pastiche.
Yeah.
I don't like them. I don't read them. And I'm like, oh, okay. But if you did read them, what are your pet peeves? Remember that question?
Well, yes, I read yours. I mean, my pet peeves are inauthenticity, I guess, in the sense of, first of all, the writers haven't done their homework. They don't really know Sherlock Holmes other than maybe they saw the Universal films or something like that. And they don't pay attention to the language, the customs, the history. It doesn't feel like something that Arthur Conan Doyle or John Watson would have written.
Right. And I remember you had a particular thing that irritated you. And it was so funny. You said, I don't like it when they linger too much on food. Do you remember telling me that? Because John Watson doesn't talk about the food a lot.
Right. And of course, it's a subject that it's easy to write about, but it's just not, it doesn't feel like the real thing. We've got Sherlock Holmes who sort of disdains food.
Yes,
Watson, he never talks about what he ate other than when he was with Holmes.
Right. So once in a while, but he doesn't linger on it. You're right. He doesn't really linger on anything like that. He's not he doesn't wax poetic about the weather and all the scenery. I mean, he sets the scene, boom, and he gets you in the story, but he doesn't, he's sort of a kind of, I always think it was sort of muscular prose, man of action kind of thing.
Yeah. So, but you and I have talked about why people write pastiche.
Right.
Pastiche, by the way, is an old French word. It means some sort of pastry, but in the context of this and other authors, it basically means writing a book that is intended to, I guess the only way to put it is imitate the original stuff. So, why do you want to write pastiche?
Otherwise known as ersatz Holmes.
Yes.
Well, I think because something that Nick Meyer once said, which is we've read them all and we want more. So I've wanted more since I was a little kid. I read them all, at age 10, and I just loved them. So I've followed, every incarnation through the movies and television, including ones that aren't direct incarnations, like House, for example. And I just love this character and the notion of and the friendship. And the whole thing, really. So it just became, the first book was just kind of a challenge to myself, an exercise, and can I do this? And because I wanted it, I just wanted the book. And I didn't expect really to find a publisher. I expected to self-publish. And at the same time I wrote the book, I illustrated the book, and I was just planning to put it out as something I wanted to do. And so it came about that way. And then it turned out to be bought by HarperCollins and then turned into a series. But initially it was really just writing the book I wanted to read, because I love these books. I love the stories. And the other thing is I wanted to try an experiment, because Conan Doyle wrote 56 short stories and 4 novellas, and the novellas themselves were not all that long. And so I really thought it would be fun to expand this to a novel length. And then the challenge, what does that mean? How do you preserve the feeling of the originals, the pacing of the originals, the tone and so forth? How do you then extend that out to a novel? So that became kind of like a writing challenge. And that was just really, that tickled me. So I enjoyed it.
You've taught writing for years.
I have.
Mostly screenwriting or book writing too?
Well, my classes at UCLA Extension, where you've taught also, Les, I took one of your classes, it was in scene writing for screenwriters, but scene writing applies to novel writing too. But I've been in the film business I was in the film business about 30 years, something like that. I was a story executive at Universal in feature films. I did story development, so I did notes on all the drafts of the movies that were in work at the time, and did coverage. I did, basically worked as the book editor does with writers. I worked with screenwriters in that way. And then I left to be a screenwriter, and I wrote the original draft of the first drafts of Tron, and then I wrote a bunch more movies that didn't get made but were bought, and so went on from there. But yeah, I've been writing for a very long time.
So Nick Meyer, who has talked publicly at length about why he has a similar compulsion to write new Sherlock Holmes adventures,
Right.
talks about the gold standard. He said, these are the best, and it's a challenge to see if you can come up to that standard.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a worthy artistic goal. I mean, for me, it's like any art form that uses all of me gets my attention and is fun for me to do. So I would say it demands a tremendous amount. So it is a test to see how close can you get to that. It's a bit of hubris, obviously, because the guy is a genius. Conan Doyle is a genius. There's a reason that 130 years later, he's just being read daily by millions of people, and it's the most recognizable fictional character of all time. So there's a reason for that. And so, like I said, it is kind of hubris to try, but then in the trying, as an artist, you raise your game.
And I must say, I mean, you have gone well beyond sort of a puppet show. This isn't taking somebody else's characters and making them move around and talk and all that. You've invented, first of all, plausible plots, but you've also invented some great characters yourself who fit neatly into the world. And you haven't just confined yourself to people that were already sort of pre-written for you.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think one of the beauties of his work is the colorful secondary characters and the people that come in and are affected by the cases or are the villains or whatever. And Conan Doyle is kind of a master craftsman in terms of drawing these pictures of people in a very few lines. It's like a great caricature artist, just get a few lines and you get the whole sense of the person. And he was a very astute observer, obviously, himself. So it is a challenge to try to do that, but it's fun because I love the Victorian era anyway, and character writing is the essence of screenwriting. It's and characters that you can capture in a few lines of dialogue and a single an entrance or a single action, and that tells you so much about the characters. So what I love is that Conan Doyle his writing's called cinematic, even though he predated cinema, obviously, for most of the time he was writing Holmes. And but it's because he used dialogue so well, and also because his visual descriptions were very crisp. I guess that'd be the best way to put it. So yeah, and I love writing characters. I tend to put a lot of interesting women in my books because I want to read them. Yeah, it's you have to write the books you want to read, right?
Well, I was thinking of the two characters who we have seen now multiple times. There's your young girl who you can
Effie O'Malley.
Yes.
Yeah.
And your French detective.
Right.
So are you tempted to write spin-offs with them, or do you have any thoughts about sort of fleshing them out even more?
Well, I have a spin-off series in development. And Heffy will appear in that one. Definitely. I might even bring in Vidocq, possibly. I do have a spin-off.
I love Vidocq because he reminds me very much of Flashman. He's just sort of so full of himself and so full of baloney that I don't know if you know George Fraser's Flashman series, but he's a cad and a liar and a braggart and all those things, but he has a certain charm, and Vidocq is very much like that. And I think a series of his adventures in which maybe he prevails, but he sort of prevails despite himself.
Yeah, accidentally.
Yes.
Yeah. He is a fun guy. Maybe that's interesting. You say that, Les. I'll have to entertain that thought a little more seriously because, yeah, he is a lot of fun. I see him in my mind's eye as it kind of looks like Jean Dujardin of The Artist. He's this very French kind of bullshit guy. I love him now. Yeah, he's a lot of fun.
And they enliven the books. I mean, it's great for a novel. It feels like you need more than just Holmes and Watson to excite you. You got to be able to sort of shift other points of view and so on. And you've done that very, very well in your books. So
Well, thank you, Les. One of the things I thought about, well, expand it to a larger canvas, I guess, is that you kind of need a little bit of theme. You kind of need a little bit of underpinning of, but it's genre fiction. There's no question about it. It's an adventure. You're taking the reader on a ride, so you have to map out the ride and provide the thrills, provide the laughs, the scariness, and so forth. But then you also, I feel like, because it's a novel, it needs a little bit more something, and so I do wanted to, in each of these, explore a little bit about either Holmes or Watson, in some cases both, a little bit more about them personally, but without raising the curtain too much, because Holmes's mystique is one of his biggest charms, is that we don't know everything about him.
You've worked hard to make them fit into what we do know.
Yes.
But I mean, you're not contradicting, you're not revealing that Professor Moriarty was really just a figment of his imagination or something like that. But at the same time, we are finding out things that we don't know about these characters without grand invention. You've talked about Holmes's youth in some of the stories, and more of Watson's backstory and so on. But let's talk about the themes. I think you said it correctly. In a short story, it's more about the action. Obviously, there's some point to the story, right, but a novel needs to have sort of more meat. And you have had very serious themes in your books. Do you want to talk about the theme of this one?
Yeah, this one, I usually start with the title. And so I did with this one as well. What Child Is This? And of course, that's a famous Christmas song to the tune of Greensleeves. And it was famous then, even, in Holmes's time. And so What Child Is This kind of brought up the question of, like, is there a child missing? Is there some identity confusion about this child? Whose child is this? What child is this? Where is this child? And as I started to just kind of do my little right brain dancing around this notion, which is the way I start, to be a child in late Victorian times, if you were not wealthy, it was a very dangerous thing to be. You were very vulnerable as a child, because you were wanted to work in factories and to work in practically slave labor in large houses. You really didn't have much say over your life unless you had, sorry about the sirens, unless you had a lot of protection. And so, Dickens, of course, is, told the story, but he himself, was working in a factory. So these kids that were either working in factories or were stuck in workhouses with very poor parents, their lives there were just endangered, basically. So you're very vulnerable as a child in Victorian England. Of course, in the upper echelons, you were treasured because childhood was suddenly romanticized. By the end of the 19th century, childhood had in the upper classes had become, they were just toys, and everything was done for them. And you'd see a lot of ads about baby soothers. There's little liquids that you could do to help your child sleep if they were fussy.
Right, laudanum,
yes, it had opiates in them, and they didn't realize the danger, obviously, or if they did, they didn't care. But in any case, but a lot of attention was paid to children. And then the whole notion of Christmas as we know it now and as we celebrate it now came to its peak in that late Victorian time because of Prince Albert and his bringing all that stuff in from Germany. When he married Queen Victoria, he brought in all the Christmas traditions of his homeland, the tree and the presents and the little oranges and all the games and stuff. And so all of those things that we now think of as Christmas and stuff came from him. And then once the royal family adopted it, of course, everybody wanted to adopt it. And so all those things kind of started to wash in. And but the theme really became about the vulnerability of children.
So what's a workhouse? Tell us about that.
Workhouses were an institution that they started in the previous century, but they were in full flower at the end of the 19th century. And they were big institutions that were dotted around the countryside, but there were several in London. And the biggest was out my back window of this flat, right in Marylebone. It was the Marylebone Workhouse. Huge, huge footprint. And what it was is it was one step up from jail, basically. And what it was designed to keep people off the streets and keep them from freezing or starving to death. And it did that. So in that sense, it was doing good, and it was set out to be a place to save people. So you only went there, though, as a last resort, because once you went there, first of all, they took all your clothes and they washed them and fumigated them with sulfur and kept them and gave you a uniform. And then you were put to work, and the men and the women were separated, families were separated, and slept in big dormitories with giant religious sayings over the ceilings. And they were put to work in very menial, awful tasks, and they had to do that to pay for their way. And then in return, they had a place to sleep, clean clothes, and food. So their lives were saved, but their lives were not very happy. And and it was very hard to get out of that because you couldn't save enough money or make contacts or get work. It was just very hard to get out of that situation. So people only went there as a last resort, and a number of people just chose not to and just died. But anyway, if you were a child and you were born into this, for example, or brought in as a tiny child, it was just a very dangerous situation.
This sounds like clearly a very contemporary problem.
Yep, it is. It is still a problem.
It's LA has got where
Yes.
I am has serious homeless issues. Most major cities do. So the Victorians made an earnest attempt to deal with it and
it
failed.
was a well-meaning attempt. It was a well-meaning and did save people's lives. Unlike probably not going to freeze to death in Santa Monica, which is partly why there's so many homeless on the west side there. But in London you would freeze to death. Winters, of course, were much colder then than they are now, and this was saving people's lives, but at a great expense. It was well-meaning. They hoped to get people back on their feet, but the rehabilitative aspects of the whole organization were not strong enough, and so as a result, they ended up being kind of a sink for these people. And eventually they stopped. So literally I have a map of the time period of that time, a detailed map, and out my back window, looked down onto a little courtyard that was part of the Marylebone Workhouse plant, more or less. And that little courtyard was the insane men's courtyard. It's where the insane men took their air. It's a tiny little triangular courtyard.
Well, tell us more about your research. This is I know that you were sort of stuck inside for the pandemic, but tell us about the research that you were able to do and the sources that you used. So,
well, I had to rely entirely on books that I ordered in, and which I always order a bunch, and online research. So I use maps and I use
So unlike other books, this is all set in London.
This is all set in London. Yeah, the others usually, if the pandemic is not happening, I location scout for my books. I actually go to the locations and map them and walk them and find relics of that time, and I do quite a few things like that. But that's not available.
This takes place largely in the Whitechapel area, the East End.
No, it takes place in
both, right?
It takes place in Baker Street. It takes place in Mayfair in a very fancy house, a very rich house, a large one in Mayfair, and then it takes place in the East End as well. So they kind of travel around those areas.
London was such a place of contrasts at that time. I mean, books like Arthur Morrison's Child of the Iago. I don't know if you looked at that. Mm-hmm. It's a story about a child lost in Whitechapel, basically. Not lost only in the sense of spiritually lost. I don't mean literally lost. A child of the streets. We see a little of that in the original stories. We see the Baker Street Irregulars.
Yeah, the irregulars are from that group, definitely. Yeah, I mean, there were kids running barefoot in the freezing winter and just dying from this, really. Yeah.
But London was very much, sort of two countries. I mean, the West End was cozy and smelled good, because somebody explained to me once that, by the way, the river, the wind comes in off the river and it blows west to east largely. So the eastern end of the city gets all the smells, and there's nothing to sort of clear it out.
Well, in the eastern end of the city, like near the Isle of Dogs and in that area, that's where a lot of industry was. So canning and a lot of tanning, and just south of the river there too. So that was where a lot of the smelly stuff was done. So that, these factories were belching out ghastly odors. And sometimes,
right. So if you're in the West End, you didn't have to put up with that.
No, you didn't. No, not so much. I mean, you had to put up with a lot of coal smoke because everybody was heating their houses with coal.
Oh, and horse manure, of course.
And horse manure. But in the nicer areas, those were picked up pretty regularly.
I see. Okay.
So it was kept nice in certain areas. That's still kind of true. That different areas have different levels of services, I guess, maybe. But generally, of course, we have a much higher standard of cleanliness than.
Right. But there was a certain degree of, what shall I say, isolation of the West End from the East End. I mean, so that you had books like George Sims', How the Poor Live kind of books that were necessary. I mean,
right.
They were necessary for the rest of London and the rest of England to understand the conditions that the poor were enduring in the East End.
Wasn't there a line in one of the Holmes stories where he says, "You always carry a gun east of Aldgate" or something like that? Some line about that. Remember that? Something like that.
No.
There are areas where you just didn't go. You just didn't go at all, or you went with friends and great care because there were dangerous enclaves and very dirty and awful places. There's the Booth poverty maps. I'm sure you know those. And most Sherlockians who are interested in the period have looked at these beautiful maps made in the 1880s, where every single block has been mapped by this guy who painted them different colors depending on the economic level.
Well, we see that sort of sense of a foreign country in some of the stories too. I mean, we see it in we see it in The Man with the Twisted Lip, where Holmes has to sort of go down by the docks and into that area where it's alien turf.
Yes, it's very alien turf. Yeah, in my let's see, the third book, and it was in The Devil's Due. Yeah, I think it was the third book. Yeah, the third book. I had them go down to low tide near the docks, and I actually went down there with a man who was an expert on the history of that area. Just prior to Holmes's time, that was a big shipping capital, so they built all these ships there, and that industry had just died out. And then it was Holmes's time, but there were remnants of that industry there. But that's where they had the slaughterhouses. They had these big smelly factories. It was just a really kind of very creepy, scary place to be. And then of course the Thames being tidal, come in and out would be very dangerous. so it was, London is full of strange, interesting places. We think of the theater, the theater area. We think of all the beautiful parks. I mean, there's so much gorgeous stuff, museums, churches. But London has many sides.
Yes, and of course, it was also a time that many have thought was hypocritical. You had the wealthy, the intellectuals seeking to do good, but they didn't really want to get their hands dirty, and they thought of themselves as highly civilized, benevolent, etc. So this is a theme, of course, explored in Jekyll and Hyde as well. But
yes, and I want to ask you about. Tell me when it's time. I'd like to ask you a few questions about that book.
Anytime.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, so what we're also celebrating here is your book, which is the annotated version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is a
Yes,
masterwork.
I just happen to have a copy here somewhere.
Just happened to. Yes. Good. It is astonishing and beautiful, as all your books are. And I don't know how you do this. You put so much work out, and you work full time. I don't know, Les, you just astonish me.
It's, you know,
But I was looking through the book, and once again, the illustrations are so powerful and so beautiful. I mean, that is a story, of course, that has lasted, through the years and has tickled people's imaginations. Why do you think the notion of a dual life was so shocking then and still is shocking now?
I think, this, as I said, this sort of gets into the issue of hypocrisy. I mean, we're all Jekyll and Hyde in the sense of having, as Stevenson put it, that old war of the members, the impulses that we have, the desires to do good mixed together with the desires for personal satisfaction and pleasure. And we're all sort of struggling to balance those. And this is a timeless story about a man who had wrong-headed ideas about the best way to do that. This is not a story, as many think, about sort of a poor scientist who inadvertently lets loose a monster. This is a man, Dr. Jekyll, who thinks he can be a better person by sort of segregating the good parts and the bad parts of his own personality.
He's already acknowledging that he has these, which is
yes.
definitely right.
And he certainly does a good job on the bad side in terms of giving, creating someone with the perfect alibi always for any bad things he wants to do. Namely, he can literally disappear. He changes back into Dr. Jekyll, and Mr. Hyde is suddenly gone from whatever bad act he's done, from whatever scene he's invaded, and so on. So, but for Jekyll, it doesn't work very well. It doesn't make him a better person. And of course, the tragedy that he suffers is that he eventually loses control and can't decide whether he's going to be Jekyll or Hyde. It becomes all sort of a matter of chemistry, if we may say that. But this was Stevenson very much looking at the, I keep using the word hypocrisy, the ambivalence, the two-sided personalities of everyone. Stevenson himself struggled with this. He was under pressure to be a conformist, successful, to succeed as an architect. He went to law school at some point, but his family wanted him to do that. He wanted to be an artist. He wanted to write, and he felt that he was himself a hypocrite for not living up to his own artistic ideals. Ultimately, he did chuck the sort of conventional life and moved to Samoa, where he indulged in his art being poetry and short stories and novels and historical fiction and the like.
That had to be a really radical move for that time.
Yeah, but he had done a lot of traveling. He was very fortunate. His wife was also a great traveler. She'd come from America, and she was ready for this. They were basically sailing around the world, and they liked Samoa, and they decided to stay. So it wasn't, hey, let's go to Samoa. It was more accidental than that, I think. But I love the book because of some of the things you've already talked about with regard to Holmes, and that is what shall we call it? The immortality, the plasticity of it. I mean, this is a story that has been widely adapted to comic books, graphic novels, and of course, stage and screen. It's not quite up there in terms of the numbers of Sherlock Holmes films. It's only like in the 150 film range or something, as opposed to as opposed to 250 maybe for Sherlock Holmes, and more every minute. But it fascinates me that these stories have such resonance, have such magnetism, that they draw creators to use these iconic characters and exploit them for their own purposes. I mean, no film.
You described some of the films in detail, and the tracking through of the story is different in the different adaptations. So people were kind of bending it to make the point they wanted to make in a way.
Yes, and one of the early distortions is essentially the same distortion that happened with Frankenstein. The very first, I mean, Mary Shelley, on her way back from Italy, where she was residing when Frankenstein was published, came to London and found that Frankenstein had already been put on the stage by somebody. That happened a lot in the 19th century because there was no copyright protection for the theater if you didn't yourself produce a play. So, which is why Bram Stoker wrote a play right away, but that's a whole other issue. But she came back to find a stage play of Frankenstein that was called Presumption. And the point I wanted to make is that was what it was about. Don't mess with things that God didn't mean us to know. That was really what that playwright's take on Frankenstein was. And similarly, Jekyll and Hyde has been distorted. They generally they create a love interest. They make Jekyll a heroic person who is victimized by this monster that he's let loose inadvertently, or maybe intentionally, but he thought he could keep him under control, and so on. And that is not the original story. The original story is much more about the failings of Dr. Jekyll to do the responsible thing of integrate his own personality and control his evil impulses, as opposed to just letting them loose.
I want to ask you something. I read, I can't remember what the source of this was, but I read somewhere that science fiction kind of was born with Frankenstein, and obviously carrying on in this story as well. And I read that the reason it came about when it did was that prior to the 19th century, everybody could kind of more or less count on living the same way their grandparents did. And then suddenly the rate of science changed. The Industrial Revolution started, trains, watches, all of a sudden life completely changed. And then change changed. The rate of change changed. And suddenly there was like the future could be anything, and it was upending and so forth. And now there came along this fantastic fiction based on some of these things. So like Mary Shelley was based on the experiments of, I forget his name, that was making things jump with electricity.
Galvani.
Galvani. And it was me on the G. And so, that sparked.
Well, I think that's right. I think that so, all of this, I don't know that I'd call it science fiction. I mean, by the way, there are earlier works than Frankenstein. There's pieces like The Blazing World and so on. They are explorations of the social consequences of change or inquiry that was underway.
Changes that we don't really understand. We're messing with them, but we don't really understand them.
Well, or we do understand them, and what's the implication? I mean, this goes on. This is going on and on. I mean, H.P. Lovecraft, for example, was a real pioneer of what we now think of as modern science fiction, because he was fascinated by the discoveries of astronomy and physics, and very much wanted to explore life might exist on other worlds, and what the consequences would be for us. Not just, hey, you get to meet an alien, but what that would tell us about ourselves. To understand those things. And so, yes, absolutely, these things fascinated many writers of the period. Stevenson, I don't think it was so much for Stevenson. It wasn't about the chemistry. He was interested in the psychology of it, because remember, this is also a time when Freud is announcing his ideas and all that. There had been writers discussing multiple personalities, what we call split personalities. Those were a thing that people knew about. And I think Stephen sort of wanted to push that a bit and see what was going on. He also had a real life example that he knew of, a man known as Deacon Brodie.
Yes,
who,
right.
Who lived his life as a respectable minister of the church during the day.
Right?
By night, he was a robber. He led a gang of robbers. And Stevenson was fascinated by that.
I think it's so interesting that, all of the study of the human mind was sort of nascent at that time. And so it's certainly like what we call bipolar illness was known because Conan Doyle described it in poems directly. So I mean, it was known. It may not have been labeled that, et cetera. So, but yeah, I think they were starting to really look at the human mind and try to map it and figure out what the heck.
Conan Doyle was remarkably farsighted about cocaine and what that did. This is a time when, if you look in the Britannica, you look up cocaine, you'll see nothing but nice things about how the coca relieve fatigue and things like that, sharpened the mind, etc.
Right. So, it was also an anesthetic.
Yeah. So Conan Doyle was interested in the addictive thing. I mean, addiction was very poorly understood.
Right. Yeah, he was definitely ahead of the curve. Although more people were onto the germ theory of disease, but still everybody wasn't, even at that time. But he, of course, was, and he was a forward-thinking doctor. And doctors are sometimes the slowest to pick up on the advancements. As a profession, they're known to be slow to adopt. But Conan Doyle was definitely running in the front of the pack there.
Well, so two other things I want to talk about your book before we take questions. One is you mentioned all the wonderful illustrations in mine, and yes, there's 150 illustrations. They're beautiful color posters, book covers, etc. You have an illustrated book. How did that come about?
Oh, that came about in such a nice way, Les. I saw Frank Cho, who's, of course, the Marvel artist. He's a superstar for Marvel. He does a lot of their covers. And anyway, he's a Sherlockian, and he did a couple of beautiful designs for the programs for the BSI dinners. And I saw these, and I was like, oh, my God, I love these. So I started talking to him. As you know, I'm an artist myself, not in the same caliber, but I love art. And so I started corresponding with him, and he turned me on to Franklin Booth, who is a pen and ink illustrator of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Just got so into this work, and his work for the BSI evokes some of this beautiful line work that Franklin Booth did. And so we started talking about that, and I said, and then when I got the idea to do a Christmas novella, and then I thought, what would make this really be a gift book? I mean, it's something that you would want for Christmas. It would be beautiful illustrations by Frank Cho. So I asked him, and he said yes, and I was thrilled. And HarperCollins made the deal with him, and so he illustrated the book beautifully.
In the tradition of the Strand magazine, not quite as many as in the Strand, but
beautiful. I was so thrilled. And the originals are quite large. I can show you one. It's right behind me here if you want me to hold one.
Well, so what your fans will really want to know, Bonnie, is what's next?
Oh, the next one is book 6 in the series. It's called A Serpent Under, and it's going to be mostly London and London adjacent. It has to do with a heinous crime that takes place at Windsor Castle, and then some other long-standing historical things that bring in people from all over London.
Next year, or
I wish. These things take me like 2 years. Les, they've been taking me 2 years to do. I would like them to be quicker, but I don't have your speed. I really don't. No. But I'm hoping maybe the end of next year, early 2024, hopefully, maybe the end of 2023.
Well, so this might be a good time to take questions from the audience.
We don't have any questions. I was going to send you the message about it, but we have a quiet crowd.
Right.
Told them to have questions.
I don't know. We cannot see you if you're.
Les, can you see me?
I can.
Yeah.
No, I can see you.
I think it might be a
Bonnie
issue
see
again.
the chat. She couldn't see.
Can't see Chad or I can't see myself either. I don't. Do you see yourself on these on this?
Absolutely, and boy, am I good looking. So
yes, you are. Yes, you are. I have been in that beautiful library before. That is a fantastic library you got there, Les.
well, and the sad part is the sad part. I mean, the good part. They're sort of almost all books about Sherlock Holmes. There are many other books here, but this is the Sherlockian part.
This is the Sherlockian library, yeah. Well, I have that relatively small one in LA.
Well, relatively small.
Well, no, but the Sherlockian section is relatively small compared to that, for example. And I remember you came there and you looked at my Sherlockian bookshelf and you said, "Well, it's a start."
But you have yours cataloged.
Well, that's the rest of the library, yeah. But Alan is an avid reader. We do have a ridiculous library with cataloged by we do. Yours is not cataloged. I would be surprised.
Well, it's cataloged in a different way. Absolutely, it's cataloged. I'm a great believer in cataloging because I'm a lawyer, and I often represent collectors, and I worry about what's going to happen when they're gone. And cataloging is the kind thing you can do for your family. So I have a very detailed catalog of my Sherlockian books and a very detailed catalog of all of my other books, the books that I own. But the books, they're not numbered. I lose books. That's the problem. It's like someone mentioned a book the other day, and I said, "Oh, I have a copy of that. It's quite rare and all that." It's there somewhere.
Yeah.
Not sure where. They're alphabetical mostly.
Yeah, I see. But yeah. Oh. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to catalog books. I mean, I think we even went over we spent quite a while trying to pick out which cataloging system to use, and we ended up with the one that the Library of Congress uses. But where the funniest cataloging system is in the London Library. Have you ever been there?
No, I haven't. You're talking about the London Lending Library.
It's just called the London. Yeah, and Conan Doyle was a member there, and anyway, it's
as was Bram Stoker.
Yes, right, exactly. A lot of very famous people that were members there, and it's kind of like just completely randomly, alphabetically by topic, but alphabetically by topic, not by any kind of connection of these topics.
Well, that's sort of like mine. I have books grouped as, there's pastiche here, right behind me. On this wall are reference, and they're alphabetical within those sort of categories.
I see.
So it makes it somewhat easier to find things. But even so, then there's oversized books. Oversized are all on a different shelf, and it's like, oh my gosh, I can't find them anymore. So
in the London Library, there's one whole wall of tiny books. They're like little tiny books. but they're randomly I don't know, just
it's like a bookstore. Bookstore sites are alphabetical within sections.
Yeah, sections are very weird. But another funny thing about the London Library is it was all men for a very long time, and for good reason, because there's stairs between the different floors, and the stairs are made out of iron, and they've got holes. They're all full of holes so that the heat can rise and heat the whole building. But of course, if you're a woman and you're walking up the stairs, anybody can see right up your dress. So women were not allowed.
Well, one of the interesting things about the library is that they discovered recently books that Stoker had checked out in the process of writing Dracula, and he had written notes in them.
Yeah, that's great. I read that too. Yeah, they found his notes.
It wasn't he wasn't a nice patron, but
I think things were a little looser then. Maybe, I don't know.
We're glad he did. We're glad he did.
Yeah.
So. Yes, but Stoker and Doyle were friends. They weren't exactly close friends, but they both had sort of a strong interest in theater. Stoker, of course, was the manager of the Lyceum Theater. And there was a circle of all of these writers, kind of like today. There was a circle of all of them. So
I'm typing to McKenna to see if she wants to type in the questions because we can't see or hear her.
I'm
So
typing to Bonnie that we don't have
There she
questions.
is.
Either she
Okay.
can leave again or come back. But I think if she can hear you, Les, maybe
Are
you
you
can just
there?
relay that to her.
yeah, there's no questions, Bonnie. So we're just vamping.
Oh,
So
okay.
so let me ask you another question that often comes up, and I know many listeners want to understand this, and that is about your craft. So, outliner, pantser, do you write all day? Do you write in the mornings? Tell us about how you produce books.
It's evolved over time. Originally, I started with a title, a theme, what the main crime was, and then I just began to pants. Over time, I've added to that. I find where the big action scene is and what it is. I just describe what the jeopardy is. And then I kind of very loosely outline and then pants. I think of myself as more of a pantser. And
So
I've
you
always,
know who did it, and you know who's going to discover it, of course.
I don't know how he does though. I don't know how
Right.
Holmes figures it out. That comes out in the working out. But as I've moved through the series, I've become a little bit more of a planner. And I just read, I think the best book I've read in years, and it was A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. I don't know
Love
if
the
you read
book.
that. Oh God, that just Anyway, so and I saw a very long interview with him about his craft, and I got very inspired by this. It's like I have to try this because look what he does. Oh my God! But it is a very individual thing. But he designs his book very very in great detail, and then he starts writing. But he admits that in the writing, his right brain leaps in, and it often will go new places. It doesn't adhere exactly, but that he feels his right brain can be really free and loose because he knows he's not going to get way off. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting. But I've been more of a pantser, and you think of mystery writers. And crime writers, as they call it here in England, that you think of that kind of writing as being all designed. But most mystery writers that I know are pantsers.
Do you stick to a fixed schedule? Do you write every day?
Yes. Oh, I write every day, 7 days a week, and I write first thing in the morning. There's this new term for that's taken off, swallow the frog, which is like get up and do your hardest thing first in the day, like whatever it is that you kind of I don't want to do this, or I'm scared to do this, or do that first. Well, for me, it's just like my whole day is not okay if I'm not writing. So I have to write every day. So that's the first thing I do. And I'm a member of a group which I highly recommend, Les. You might enjoy it. It's called the London Writers Salon. You hardly need anything to get more productive because you're the most productive writer I know, having had many other careers at the same time. But anyway, the London Writers Salon meets at 8 a.m. in London, in New York, in LA, and in Sydney. And it meets for an hour, and you just pop on and Zoom, and you just basically sit in a big silent room with other writers, and you have the choice of writing or doing nothing. But you just leave your camera on mostly, and you just.
And people can watch you do nothing, and what they can't see is that you're secretly doing the spelling bee or whatever. So
Well, but you have to code of honor, right?
you look like you're writing.
No, you have to have a code of honor. The whole point of it is to go like, hey, it's kind of like church. This is like you've come to do. This is the thing that's important to you. The thing that feeds your soul. So you show up and you do it.
All right. Well, we are about out of time.
We are. Bonnie, can you see or hear me now?
So yeah, McKenna said she was gonna duck out, come back, and that's a while ago. So
I don't
she's
think
back.
Okay.
You can't see her, but she's back.
You can see her?
You're being ghosted, Bonnie. Don't take it personally. So
I think that
have I disappeared off here?
Okay, so let McKenna wrap up now. So
actually, Les, I'm gonna let you wrap up because you're the only one we can both see.
Okay. Well, so
we can say thank you to everyone watching.
We're very grateful to everybody for watching. The old saying about that vintners have about the vintage, the best wine they've ever made is always their most recent one. So Bonnie's new book, What Child Is This? Available at Murder by the Book and at other places online should you need. and also my new book, the new annotated Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And while you don't, McKenna, have any yet, I will be happy to send you signed book plates.
We'd love that.
For copies if people would like to buy them through you.
Perfect.
For more information about us, it's BonnieMacBird.com, LeslieSKlinger.com. And thank you so much for being with us today.
All right. Thank you. Bye.